ourselves, which is, why did the Egyptians agree to this? Seems like a terrible thing to do, to take all the babies of a people and throw them into the river. And in fact, we read about Shifra and Puah who don't do it. And you could say, well, it was the ancient world and child sacrifice was known, which is true. Or that we have terrible examples in history of people attacking entire populations, which is true. But still, just the prospect of taking infant children and casting them one after another into a river, you've got to ask yourself, what motivated ancient Egyptians into thinking this was okay? And I think that part of the reason, and maybe most of the reason, that we don't think of as much today because it no longer exists in the world is that Pharaoh was a god. He wasn't a king. I mean, he was a king, but he was also a god. And you don't question the decrees of a god. In fact, Shifra and Puah, the two midwives who don't do what Pharaoh says, the Torah says explicitly because they feared God. So they knew that Pharaoh wasn't God, and therefore they could do something else. And that idea that the king was God was an idea that was universal in the ancient world. Sometimes people got deified. There's a famous passage about Tiberius, the Roman emperor, who knew he would be turned into a god after he died. And as he was dying, he said, "Sadly, I'm about to become a god." But the notion that the ruler is a god doesn't only exist in political arenas. There are, after all, religions that make their founders into gods. And even if not into gods, then sometimes into prophets who are uncriticizable, which is almost divine. In contrast to all of this, to Pharaoh, to Tiberius, and even, as long as Iran is on the agenda this morning, I don't know if you know this story about the son of Cyrus, of Koresh, Cambyses. This is told by the Greek historian Herodotus. He says, Cambyses once decided he wanted to marry his sister. So he went to all the wise men of Persia and he said, find me a rule that says that the king can marry his sister. And they go off into the archives, I suppose, of ancient Persian law, and they come back and they say, well, we can't find a rule that says explicitly that the king may marry his sister, but don't be upset, because we found a rule that says that the king can do whatever he wants. So think about that as a model for how human societies have been set up, and now we come to this morning. And we come to the greatest figure in Jewish history, our guy, the guy. And he is a baby crying in a basket. Moses doesn't start off as anything like a god. He's a vulnerable child. Because that's what people are. They're not gods. And it's such an important message that we, in fact, know that not only is Moses a vulnerable, weeping child in a basket, but he gets lucky to be saved by a woman in the ancient world, which is also someone, as you know, of greater compassion but less status. So your hero is a baby who cries and is saved by a woman. Do you realize what a subversion that is of all the usual ways in which a hero is supposed to come into the world and what they're supposed to be? And then when Moses grows up, people don't listen to him the way they listen to Pharaoh. His own people don't listen to him. They rebel against Moses all the time. And nobody for a moment thinks Moses is godlike. In fact, the tradition says one of the reasons that we don't know the burial place of Moses, because nobody does, is so that no one will make the mistake of going to his grave and worshiping there. Because this is a human being. And now take the other greatest figure in Jewish history next to Moses, King David. Moses founds the people in the desert, and David creates the state by founding Jerusalem. One, the mountain of Sinai, one, the mountain of Zion. And David is the farthest thing from a god. In fact, as we know, just like Moses, David sins. And just in case you forget, when I say David sins, I don't mean like, he didn't pay his taxes. Which I guess he didn't because he was the king, but nonetheless. I mean, he sees a woman on a roof in Jerusalem and summons her and sleeps with her and discovers she is pregnant and married. And so he finds out that her husband, Uriah, is fighting for Israel. He's fighting a battle for Israel, so he calls him back from the front where this person whom he has betrayed is fighting on behalf of his own kingdom. And he tries to get him to sleep with his wife so that no one will know that the child is David's. And Uriah says, no, I couldn't do that while my partners are fighting, while my brothers and sisters are fighting. How could I violate their honor by sleeping with my wife? I need to be a soldier like they are. And by the way, Uriah is a Hittite. He's not even an Israelite. And so David does what you would do in such a situation. He gets him drunk. He figures now he'll sleep with his wife, but he still doesn't. And so David arranges for him to go back to the front and be killed. That's murder and adultery. Not a trivial sin. And then the prophet Nathan comes to him, Natan, and he says to him, I want to tell you about a situation that's happening in Israel. And David says, what is it? And he goes, well, there's a rich man who has lots of flock and sheep and herds, and then there's a poor man who has one sheep that he loves. And the rich man took the poor man's sheep and served it up for dinner for his guests. And David says, someone who does something like that deserves to die. And Nathan says, Ata ha'ish, you are the man. In any other world, any other king in the ancient world would have killed Nathan. But David weeps and cries and begs forgiveness. Because David lives in a world in which it is understood that people are people, not gods. And that the only way to make yourself less than a person is to try to be a god. This is explicitly actually what the Midrash says about Nebuchadnezzar, who in the book of Daniel is seen on all fours eating the grass. They say a person who tries to be superhuman ends up as a beast. But Moses doesn't do that, and David doesn't do that. And so we gave to the Western world this incredible gift incredible gift. Because there is not a leader in the history of the Western world since I don't know when who doesn't have opposition and argument, who isn't seen by some people as deeply flawed, sometimes by their own supporters, sometimes by others. And that's a legacy of this morning's Parsha, even though you have to see how the dots connect to recognize that every leader is a person. And that's true not only in politics, but it's true of sports heroes and entertainment figures and on and on and on. The Jewish people take their stand on everybody is a flawed and broken and vulnerable person. We all started out as a baby in a basket crying. And yes, when you grow up, you learn all sorts of ways to show yourself as somehow more sophisticated, more defended, more able than that baby in a basket crying, but you can't hide it. That's who we all are. And in fact, at the end of Moses' life, there is a beautiful rabbinic midrash when he looks up at God and he starts to cry and he says, I just want to live long enough to go in the land of Israel. And you remember, he started out as somebody who was helpless and crying. It's really easy to see people in black and white and to see them as either ideal or awful. But that isn't our tradition. From this moment on, from the moment Moses makes his appearance, our tradition is trying to teach us that human beings are complicated and vulnerable and fragile and broken and beautiful and noble and brilliant and striving. That is a much richer legacy than seeing people as gods or as devils. So the next time you feel yourself seeing someone in terms that you know don't apply to human beings, like they're perfect or they're all black and villainous, just remember Moses and remember Pharaoh, and know that if you elevate people too high, you do them a tremendous disservice. And the image that we start out with as a people is a baby in a basket crying. And the one ultimately who hears that cry, that's God. Shabbat shalom.
Continue, Ein Kelohenu, page 204.